Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most volatile periods of modern history, the 2026 US-Iran war. But, actually, scratch that. We're not just looking at the war itself. We're looking at it through a very specific, and honestly often overlooked lens. We're focusing entirely on Pakistan's pivotal, dual role in this conflict. Why does this matter? Well, because when a localized conflict threatens to go nuclear, the nations caught in the middle kind of dictate the fate of the globe. How does a nation sitting right on the edge of a war zone navigate that terrifying spiral? And more importantly, how do they transition from being a military participant to the ultimate geopolitical peacemaker? Let's get into it.
Okay, let's set the scene by anchoring ourselves in the sheer geopolitical brinksmanship of early 2026. I mean, this wasn't just your standard political theater. With threats of total destruction dominating the headlines, a truly chaotic stage was set. The rhetoric coming from the U.S. administration made it crystal clear that this was a conflict with absolute existential stakes. And for Pakistan, a neighboring nuclear power, this wasn't happening in some distant, faraway theater. This was happening right in their backyard, creating a highly volatile environment that demanded an immediate, high-stakes response.
And you know things are tense when you just look at the immense, polarized pressure surrounding Pakistan before they even sat down at the negotiating table. When a defense minister is firing off, and then rapidly deleting, by the way, tweets calling a regional player an evil curse, you know emotions are absolutely boiling over. Public sentiment and regional alliances were essentially on fire. Pakistan was caught in a severe diplomatic crossfire. Domestically and regionally, emotions were running incredibly high as the conflict expanded, pushing Islamabad into this intensely uncomfortable spotlight where every single public statement was put under a global microscope.
But here's the thing. Before they were peacemakers, Pakistan was actually drawn into the fray militarily. Saudi Arabia invoked its Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, which compelled Pakistan to act. And act they did. They deployed exactly 8,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. I want you to think about that number for a second. That is a massive deployment. It really highlights how deeply entangled Pakistan was in the regional security architecture from the very beginning. They were bound by defense treaties that literally forced them to put boots on the ground as the threat of a wider war loomed.
And their involvement didn't just stop at ground forces. Islamabad sent a formidable air armada. Alongside those 8,000 troops, they deployed a full squadron of 16 aircraft and 2 whole squadrons of drones, with a very clear pledge to send more if required. This wasn't just some token gesture. Pakistan was projecting serious military force into the Middle East, cementing their status as an active, hard power participant in the unfolding crisis.
Now, this is where Pakistan's role becomes absolutely fascinating. In a remarkably short window of time, they had to pull off this almost invisible transition. They went from a reluctant military participant projecting air power to the primary diplomatic shield of the entire Middle East. Realizing that a full-scale war between the U.S. and Iran would be catastrophic for the region, including themselves obviously, Islamabad expertly leveraged their unique position to shift gears from warfare to intense mediation.
Realizing the stakes, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, nudged quietly by the White House, stepped up to broker a temporary halt to the hostilities. On April 5, Pakistan introduced a ceasefire framework. Now, Iran initially rejected it in favor of their own 10-point plan, but Pakistan kept the channels open. And by April 8th, they had successfully achieved what seemed totally impossible just days prior. The U.S. and Iran actually agreed to a 2-week ceasefire.
To actually facilitate this peace, Pakistan took on some insane tactical risks. I mean, think about the logistics here. Getting negotiators to the table isn't as simple as booking a commercial flight in an active war zone. So, Pakistan utilized their air force to execute a highly classified covert escort. They used fighter jets and coordinated radar blackouts to secretly and safely transport Iranian diplomats through heavily contested airspace directly to Islamabad. It was an unprecedented logistical feat just to get the two sides into the exact same city.
Which brings us to the historic Islamabad Talks in mid-April. You really have to picture the scale of this setup because it's a real David versus Goliath dynamic in terms of delegation size. On one side, you had a massive 300-member American delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. On the other side, a tightly knit 70-member Iranian team led by Parliament Speaker Ghalibafeh and Foreign Minister Araghchi. And sitting squarely in the middle, moderating this incredibly tense room, was Pakistan's highest civilian and military leadership, Prime Minister Sharif, Field Marshal Asim Munir, and Deputy PM Ishaq Dar.
Impartially observing the table, we see two heavily entrenched sides separated by deep mistrust and dueling absolute demands. The U.S. demanded nothing short of the absolute relinquishment of uranium enrichment and the complete handover of Iran's 440-kilogram stockpile. In stark contrast, Iran demanded the acceptance of their 10-point end war plan and the immediate removal of the U.S. naval blockade. Imagine being the Pakistani mediators sitting between these two absolute, contradictory extremes. Bridging that gap was a monumental task.
For 21 agonizing hours across 3 distinct rounds of talks, 1 indirect and 2 direct, the fate of the entire region just hung in the balance right inside the Pakistani capital. I mean, 21 hours. Can you imagine the sheer endurance required from the mediators to keep both parties in that room for that long? Navigating such polarized demands for that stretch of time is a huge testament to the diplomatic heavy lifting happening behind closed doors.
But despite all that intense mediation and those 21 hours of grueling effort, the initial talks concluded without a breakthrough. This reality was starkly confirmed by the American delegation, with Vice President J.D. Vance stating plain as day that no agreement had been reached. It was a massive hurdle, really proving just how complex and entrenched this conflict truly was. And the fragility of this Pakistan-led process was fully exposed on April 24th. Iranian Foreign Minister Arakchi arrived in Islamabad for a scheduled round of talks. But upon discovering that Israel was still bombing Lebanon, he flat out refused to meet, conveyed his observations to the Pakistani mediators, and immediately left. Just minutes later, President Trump abruptly canceled his envoy's trip online via Truth Social. Talk about diplomatic whiplash, right? The peace process seemed to be utterly collapsing. However, the quiet, persistent diplomacy by Pakistan and its regional partners simply refused to die. In June 2026, those resilient efforts eventually gave birth to a landmark Pakistan-mediated document, the Islamabad Memorandum. This was a 14-point framework agreement specifically designed to establish a 60-day extension of the ceasefire, basically creating a structured window to negotiate a permanent, lasting peace deal.
The memorandum itself was honestly a masterpiece of compromise, carefully balancing immediate de-escalation with incredibly complex maritime security in the Persian Gulf. Step 1 demanded the termination of military operations on all fronts, explicitly including Lebanon. Step 2 required the U.S. to end its naval blockade within 30 days. In exchange, Step 3 mandated Iran to guarantee safe, free commercial passage through the critical Strait of Hormuz for 60 days.
But let's be real. Ideology only goes so far without an economic incentive. The deal hinged on $300 billion. The memorandum included a commitment from the U.S. and regional partners to develop a massive reconstruction and economic development plan for Iran worth at least this amount. It was the giant carrot designed to make the bitter pills of negotiation palatable for Tehran.
Furthermore, in exchange for Iran suspending its nuclear expansion and entering into ballistic missile talks, the U.S. agreed to a scheduled lifting of all unilateral and UN sanctions. The language was crystal clear, providing the exact economic relief Iranian pragmatists had been desperately seeking to keep their domestic economy afloat. It represented a massive concession designed purely to stabilize the region.
Now, the sheer modern reality of how this went down is absolutely fascinating. The final document wasn't signed by leaders shaking hands in a single room in Islamabad. It was digitally coordinated across the globe, drafted on June 14, digitally signed by representatives on June 15, and finally signed remotely by the heads of state on June 17, with President Trump signing from the Palace of Versailles in France and President Pezeshkian signing remotely in Tehran. Incredible.
This effort, orchestrated by Pakistan, was so comprehensive that even the most hardline elements in Iran had to accept it. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei actually issued a written statement officially endorsing the memorandum. Even though he noted he did so despite misgivings, the fact remains that the highest, most absolute authority in Iran recognized the sheer necessity of this Pakistan-brokered off-ramp.
But we have to keep in mind that the memorandum was not a permanent treaty. It was essentially a 60-day window, a ticking clock designed to force both Washington and Tehran to hammer out a final, lasting agreement within 2 months. It was meant to be a strategic pause to allow cooler heads to prevail and finalize the complex mechanics of sanctions relief and nuclear compliance.
Tragically, though, that window shattered early. After numerous alleged violations from both sides and deep disputes over the actual scope and interpretation of the agreement's provisions, the process collapsed. Just weeks after the historic signing, on July 8, 2026, President Trump officially declared the ceasefire to be over.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look back at Pakistan's monumental effort. From deploying troops to executing covert diplomatic airlifts and hosting 21-hour negotiations, they moved mountains to stop a regional war. But seeing how it ended, we're left with a lingering high-stakes question. Did the Islamabad Memorandum actually create a viable blueprint for future peace in the Middle East, or was it merely a temporary pause in an inevitable conflict? Whatever the future holds, the ultimate takeaway is clear. In modern warfare, the countries caught on the sidelines often hold the most power. Thanks for learning with us today.